Okay, welcome to lecture for Research Methods. We'll be talking about the first part of the third chapter of the APA style manual. And chapter 3 is where you find the bulk of the advice from the manual on how to write. Chapter 4 gets into some more detailed stuff, when to use a hyphen and whatnot. But this chapter is most of the big picture stuff. And for now, we'll just start talking about the first few sections, 3.01 to 3.11, which address broad issues of organization within a manuscript and some issues related to writing style. Okay, in terms of looking at organization, talking about the typical length of a manuscript, my best advice is write enough. and that's the best I can say, because how long a paper should be really depends on a lot of things. The purpose of the paper, the content of the paper, and how much stuff you found or did and that you have to write about. But typically, if you're trying to submit something for publication, it's going to be 30 pages or less, probably less. But then if you're writing a thesis or dissertation, those often exceed 100 pages, which is odd that we train people to write by making them write way too much. Nonetheless, that's kind of how things still are. So the length of the paper is variable, but again, you want to communicate enough information. If you're doing, if it's a manuscript of a research article, you want to have enough in the introduction to give a good background. It doesn't have to be an exhaustive literature review, but enough of a literature review to give a background of what you're talking about and to justify your hypothesis. And then in the method, obviously, you have to give enough detail so somebody could replicate results. Again, enough detail that they could. That they know exactly what you found, and that they could run those analyses again to check your numbers, and then the discussion enough to get your arguments across about what your findings mean, and what maybe they don't mean, the limitations. In terms of organization, we use headings in APA style. I encourage, and there's some kind of standard headings that everybody uses. Right, the method section has a heading. The results section has a heading. It's results. But I encourage you to use headings beyond that, kind of subsection headings, to help direct readers to specific information that they may be looking for. For example, even within the introduction, sometimes you'll use headings, which the introduction itself doesn't have a main heading. It has the title of the paper at the beginning. But you might break up the introduction into separate sections with subheadings, right? So if you're writing a paper on something related to crisis intervention or trauma, you might have one part of the paper, a couple of paragraphs under the subheading early conceptualizations of trauma, where you give kind of historical background. And then you might have another section that's titled current conceptualizations of trauma. So this is what we used to think and where it's come from, and then here's how people are thinking about it now. Maybe that's and you can using subheadings helps people if they're reading a paper. They can go, okay, well, I know the history. I want to skip ahead to the next part, and it's easier for them to move around the paper and find what they're looking for. If you are going to use subheadings, be sure that if you have subsections, kind of like when you make an outline, you have to have at least 2 subsections at the same level, right? So 1A and 1B, not just 1A. In terms of the style of headings, it's a lot easier now than the old manual, or the last manual. For the levels of heading, you can look at table 3.1 in the manual for precisely how to do them. But it used to be what level or how you styled a heading depended on how many levels you had. Now it doesn't matter how many levels you have. There's always the top level, the next to the top, next to the next, and down, and so forth. And it doesn't change if you have 2 levels or 3 or 4. The top is always the same. So some examples of what that looks like. Here's a piece of a method section where level 1, the top level, is typically what your major sections will be, and then it's centered, bolded, with capitalized uppercase and lowercase letters. So that's your method, results, or data analysis section if you're writing a proposal, discussion section, reference section, abstract. And then whenever you have subsections within those major sections, then that's when you go to the level 2 heading. So here we have participants is a subsection of the method, and so it's left justified, no indentation, uppercase and lowercase letters, no period at the end, and then after the heading you hit return and you indent the next line and start writing. And then we also show in this picture here the third level of headings, and what you can't see here the full context for this, but that the valence and arousal ratings, that's a subsection of the measures subsection of the method. So within the method there's participants, and there's also potentially a measures or materials subsection, right? So if you're describing multiple measures or different types of measures, you may break those up into subsections, and that's what this is. One of the things that they measured was looked at valence and arousal ratings. So now we indent, it's still bold, capitalize the first letter but none of the rest, period at the end, and then begin writing right after it, don't hit return. Okay. And then there are also fourth and fifth levels that you might need, but typically you won't go beyond 3 levels. Sometimes if you have really complicated methods, or if you have really complicated statistical procedures where you have you're breaking findings down into kind of finer descriptions. Okay. Moving on. Still staying with the topic of organization, looking at seriation. And seriation is when you have lists of things. I mean, 3 or more things is a list. If it's just 2, you just use and. If you have more than 2, you have 3 or more, then we're talking about the rules for seriation. And how you punctuate those and capitalize and all that stuff depends on what you're working with. If your list is a thing of complete sentences, you have options. You can use numbers or bullets, but you punctuate each item as a standalone sentence. So you still capitalize, even though it's A, B, and C, where A, B, and C are all sentences. You capitalize the first letter of each one, not just the first sentence, and you also put a punctuation mark at the conclusion of each sentence. Okay. Here's an example of what that looks like. Participants were asked to identify which of the following statements best describe their parenting style. 1, I let my kids do whatever they want. 2, I rule with an iron fist. Or 3, I don't remember where my kids are. So again, you're going to capitalize the first letter of each sentence, and you're also going to punctuate the end of each sentence with either a period, question mark, exclamation point, whatever the sentence calls for. And you indent there, and notice we have a colon preceding that, and we'll talk later about rules for colons, just kind of a heads up. You only use a colon if the sentence preceding it could be thought of as a complete sentence, but again, we'll come back to colons later. The things you're seriating that you're listing might also be clauses or phrases where the thing isn't a complete sentence on its own, each piece. Whereas before we had complete sentences, right? We have a subject, verb, predicate. You don't always have that in your list of things. Usually you don't have sentences. Usually it is clauses or phrases. And you've got choices here too. You can separate them by commas or semicolons, and which one you use depends on the phrases. If any one of the phrases in your series has an internal comma, so there's a comma within it, then you separate all of the phrases with semicolons to keep from getting confused. But if none of the phrases have commas within them, then you should separate them with commas. And we'll see what that looks like in just a minute. Or you can also have them within a sentence where you have letters inside of parentheses, or use bullets if they're not within a sentence is also an option. So take a look at that. So we have the 3 options were A, eat 1 cookie, B, drink 2 sodas, and C, run 3 kilometers. So a couple things here. Notice that the phrase eat 1 cookie has no internal commas. There's no commas between the words eat 1 and cookie. Same for drink 2 sodas, same for run 3 kilometers. So since there are no internal commas in any individual phrase, I can separate all the phrases by a comma instead of a semicolon. And if I put them in a sentence, each phrase gets a letter, a lowercase letter, in parentheses. It's very particular about that. and we don't have a colon there. It's not the three options were colon, because the three options were isn't a complete sentence. Okay, okay, and we don't capitalize each phrase because again they're not complete sentences. Another example would be you could do bullets. So here we have the three options were, and again, here's where a lot of people want to put a colon because it looks like you should, but you don't for APA style. And now I've changed the phrases, so we have eat one cookie, one banana, and one pizza. So that is a phrase in and of itself, and that phrase has two internal commas. Right? And because it has internal commas, no matter if the other phrases have internal commas or not, all the phrases have to be separated by semicolons. So a semicolon at the end, and then the next phrase, which also has internal commas, semicolon, and then an and before the last one, and then the last one as well. Pretty straightforward once you get used to it. The only thing that people I know English professors and other professors often disagree about. Oh, when you have three things, do you need a comma or a semicolon before the third one? And some say, oh no, the and takes the place of it. APA style, you have to put either a comma or a semicolon, depending on, again, if you have internal commas in phrases, use a semicolon. If not, use a comma. But always put some punctuation mark before that conjunction word. If it's an and or an or whatever, if you have three things together, before the conjunction, there should be a punctuation mark. Okay. Now, getting to a little more big picture stuff. Looking at style. Right. So the continuity of your writing, which is about your one of the things it's about is your presentation of ideas. Your paper should flow logically. You're taking the reader down a path. Right. You're introducing them to an idea usually. Say, hey, here's something interesting. Here's some stuff we know about it. And then here's some stuff. Here's a question that should occur to you after I've talked about this other stuff. Nobody's looked at this. Now I'm going to look at it. I'm going to tell you how I would look at it, or how I did look at it, right? And then that's your intro, and then it flows right into your methods. Here's how I'm going to look at it. Here's how I did look at it. Here's what I found. Here's what it means, right? So you're telling a story over the arc of this paper, right? And because of that, there should be a logical flow throughout the paper, and it should occur, for one thing, from one paragraph to the next. Okay. So an example here, we have an excerpt where the first paragraph is talking about the diagnosis and course of early onset bipolar spectrum disorder has gained attention, blah blah blah. So increased from the 80s to the 90s. It's talking about the increase in diagnosis of bipolar spectrum disorders, right? And then the next paragraph is, this trend is mirrored by the increased public interest in early onset BPSD, and then it goes on to talk about the public interest, right? So it's been diagnosed more, and then and people are interested in it, and you get this kind of nice logical transition. Okay, here's the thing, this trend is mirrored by, and that's a lovely, elegant transition. Where you're reading along, and okay, and it flows and it makes sense. Okay. And when you read most published articles, if they're in good psychological journals, you'll see that, and you'll be hard pressed to identify, oh, that really flows really well. But when it doesn't flow, that's when you can say, oh God, that's painful to read. So look at an example. If we take the same article, and if we cut and paste a paragraph from somewhere else. So if we have that, okay, here's stuff about diagnosis, being diagnosed more, and then go right into differential diagnosis of mental illness requires clinical acumen. What? Like that, there's an abrupt shift in ideas, right? And it doesn't logically follow that just because bipolar disorder is being diagnosed more often, therefore you need to be good at assessment. Those things aren't logically related, and they didn't occur in that order in the paper. They took other steps to get you to that point, right? I just kind of want you to see that whenever it doesn't flow, it sticks out. So hard to teach good flow, but usually easy to see when things don't flow. At least when you're reading other people's papers. For reading your own paper, sometimes it's hard because you're making connections internally that aren't showing up on the paper. Related to that, so we have from one paragraph to the next, but also within a paragraph or within a sentence, you have to make sure that you have good continuity and this nice logical flow. And the biggest thing that trips people up are the use of these links, right? Time links, like then, next, and after. Cause-effect links, therefore, consequently. Addition links, in addition, moreover, and contrast links. But conversely, however. these links are transitional phrases that often help identify the logical connection between ideas for the reader, and they're great when you use them. And I recommend you use them. Don't use the same one over and over. Everybody tends to they have their pet transitional phrases, so mix it up. But when you do so, make sure you're using them appropriately and not using them illogically. Some example of illogical use. The first sentence here. Although participants were not allowed to communicate with each other during the experimental procedure, not all participants completed the required measures. What? And if you kind of read it quickly, it's like, okay, But when you use although, it's kind of telling the reader, okay, there's going to be an inconsistency here. So although this happened, and the second part is inconsistent with the first, contradicts the first, and that it doesn't. The fact that not all participants completed the measures isn't logically related to the fact that participants weren't allowed to communicate with each other. Right? So that's an illogical application of a linkage. Okay. The next one, men reported higher levels of anxiety when asked to complete a traditionally feminine task than when asked to complete a traditionally masculine task, and women reported lower levels of anxiety when completing a feminine task than when completing a masculine task. And that one, not as wrong as the other one. Right? So it's not horrible, but it could be better. Right? And here, it's the connection between ideas is a little innocuous because it's just an and. So men did this and women did this. But the point of the sentence, if you look at the content, is that they did the opposite things. So it would be a better sentence if we just substituted the word and, take it out, and put the word but in. So men did this, but women did this. It helps the reader identify, okay, you're about to tell me that something is different. And it is. It's the opposite pattern of findings for women than for men. Okay. And then the third one, it has been suggested that autism might be the result of undiagnosed allergic reactions, period. However, some individuals feel that this failure to identify problematic allergies is a significant problem. Again, the word however introduces the fact that there's going to be some sort of contradiction, but the second sentence does not contradict the first. They're unrelated. Okay, so that's a poor use there. One thing that is correct, however, is the punctuation. And one thing I see people often do is they would have that sentence, and instead of a period before however, they would have comma, however, and that's not right. You can't use however like but. Right? So whenever you have a sentence, here's a sentence, period, however, comma, and you go on the next one. Or you could use a semicolon, because a semicolon serves the same purpose as a period, usually. Okay. So watch out for those links. Make sure that they're logical. So use them, but make sure that they are saying what you want them to say. Okay. Smoothness of expression and tone. So continuity of ideas that we just talked about, that flow, is necessary, but not sufficient for smoothness of expression. So your ideas need to be in order and logical, but smoothness of expression kind of goes beyond that to kind of how it sounds, right? Does it sound good? And this is something that's hard to teach, and it's hard to it'll sound good if you do this. Right? It's one of those things where you just have to hear it, and you get that feel. There's a really subjective experience. And so my advice to you is, when you're writing a paper and you're working on a draft, read it out loud. Shut the door so nobody else can hear, and read your paper aloud as if you're giving a speech. And if it flows like a good speech, you probably have a good, smooth expression. If you're stumbling over the words, then you may need to work on ironing out some of the wrinkles and adding some transitions maybe. One of the things that can screw up your smoothness of expression are abrupt shifts, and that's again abrupt shifts in ideas, which are related to continuity of ideas we talked about already, but also shifts in style. For example, shifts in verb tense. If you're talking about they found, and then it is this way, that can be jarring for readers. So you try to maintain the same tense, usually at least within sections. In the introduction section, the same tense. Method section, same tense. Results, same tense. Though those may be different. Like when you've written a paper, the method section is all past tense, and the other sections may not be past tense, depending on what you're writing about. The other thing I put here is check your blind spot, and this is kind of going back to the idea that when you write, I know when I write, I fill in those logical gaps in my own head, and I read the paper and it makes sense to me, but those gap fillers that are in my head don't get down on paper, and it's really hard to see them for yourself once you get really deep into a paper and you've read so much about a particular topic and you know what you mean, and you can't. It's hard to see that you're not communicating it. So you really need to get somebody else to read your paper. And it helps if they are in the same field as you, but for some things not necessary. So for some things, people can say, well, that sentence doesn't make any sense. And you say, oh, well, you just don't know. They go, no, I have no idea what you're saying. Most people should, even if they don't understand the concepts, the paper should make sense, and there shouldn't be sentences that they go, that sentence is gobbledygook, which sometimes we write gobbledygook because, again, we're filling in those gaps ourselves. Also, you have to watch your tone when writing. In general, it should be a professional tone. So professional, but not too dry. Right? So one aspect of professional writing is not to rip on people. Right? So oftentimes people write commentary articles about other people's work, and they have to be professional in criticizing other people's findings. And a lot of times whenever you're writing stuff in the introduction, you're talking about, oh, here's other research that's been done, but there's some limitations, or they did something wrong, and that's why my research is needed. But when you're criticizing other work, you have to do it professionally. So you wouldn't say, this approach that I just discussed was completely useless for helping kids with nightmares. That might be fine with talking to your friends, but not for professional style paper. It would be something more along the lines of this approach did not significantly reduce children's experiences of nightmares. Right? Which the deep structure, the deep meaning of the sentence is the same, but the wording is slightly different, and there's a different attitude. Right? And writing professionally, conveying that professional attitude, is going to make what you've written more palatable to a professional audience. They're going to take you more seriously if you write professionally. You may be brilliant and have great ideas and do great work, but if you don't write professionally, people are going to read a few sentences and go, who's this knucklehead? And they're not going to get to the great ideas that you have. So you've got to put yourself into that professional mode, squeeze yourself into some of these restrictions in language in order to get your stuff accepted. And then once you're a famous writer, then you can add a little more style and pizzazz to your writing. And you certainly do see that with authors that have published a lot. Some students will be, wow, that doesn't look like very professional writing. They get a bit looser in their prose and a little more poetic often, even, and introduce a lot more humor. But you can't get away with that now. You can't get away with it when you're a student. You've got to get good at the professional stuff, and then later you can introduce the more of the humor and the polish. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind when trying to figure out the appropriate tone is who you're writing to, and basically you're writing to an educated audience. So imagine, my best advice is imagine that your audience for your paper is educated but not necessarily an expert in the same field as yourself. Imagine you're reading it to a professor, not just a friend who isn't a psych major. Your friend who's a business major. They don't have to understand it, because they may not understand things like introjection or libido, or those kind of psychoanalytic terms that nobody knows about except for people in psychology and counseling. I take that back. Professors in most fields are familiar with those terms, but non-professors usually don't know those things. Okay, so imagine an educated audience when writing. Okay, unlike my own tendency to use too many words when narrating these lectures, unfortunately, when you're writing, focus on an economy of expression, right? This is also referred to as the ideal of parsimony, right? And I say this with a caveat. When you're writing first drafts, when you're trying to get stuff down on paper, it's okay to have verbal diarrhea. Don't try to say it perfectly and succinctly initially. I say write it all. Write all your thoughts down, get them out. Then, before you turn anything into me or anybody else, parse it down. Go back and edit and try to say, okay, well, this sentence is 3 phrases long. I could probably squish it down into 1 phrase. And if you can, do so. So if you can say it with fewer words, do it. So one of the things we look out for in APA style, one of the things you're cautioned against is wordiness. Taking too many words to say something simple. So some examples. Looking further into the study that was conducted by Soros and Klein, 2003, it is possible to notice some of the differences between men and women regarding the choices they make of how they prefer to spend their time when relaxing or having fun. Whew, that's a long sentence, right? And I could have just said, men and women differ in how they choose to spend their leisure time. And then I cite Soros and Klein, right? And that's one of the best ways to be parsimonious is to use that parenthetical notation. When you're citing stuff, push the author's names into the parentheses and get them out of the sentence, because you end up having to add a bunch of other words to work those words in. Related to that, this doesn't seem too bad, but Smith et al. Conducted a study and found. Of course, they conducted a study and found. They didn't You could just say Smith et al. Found. Smith et al. Reported. It's not like they found this. They found that men. Men and women different how they choose to spend their time. We don't think that they found it in a glamour magazine, right? Oh, they were at the beauty shop and they were flipping through a magazine and they read this and they found it, and now I'm reporting it to you, right? There's kind of an assumption that if you say so and so found this, they reported this, that it was based on a study. You don't have to tell us that they conducted a study. The only time that you will want to say something about so-and-so conducted a study is if you're going to say something about the study, about how it's different from other studies. If you're going to say, Smith et al. Conducted the first study to examine the use of virtual reality technologies in the treatment of phobias, and they found blah, 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 fine. But you don't need to say that they conducted a study and found. Only tell me that they conducted a study if you're going to tell me something about the study. Right? Or if you say maybe Smith et al.'s study included a more ethnically diverse sample than previous studies, and they reported blah, 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 that's fine. But don't just say conducted a study ad nauseum without talking about anything about how that study is unique, because it's wasted words. Another way to optimize your economy of expression, to eliminate redundancies, saying the same thing more than once, and this can be done a couple of ways. Basically repeating the same word in the sentence. Other times it's repeating the same idea. So in the first sentence, the increased rate in suicides among male African American adolescents has been steadily increasing. So, and usually one of the ways for me to figure out if redundancy is there, I take out all kind of prepositional phrases. So I'd say the increased rate, blah, 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 has been steadily increasing. So the increased rate, and I take out adverbs, has been increasing. How can an increased rate have been increasing? You're saying the same thing. It's an increased rate, or the rate has been increasing, but not both. It's the same idea twice, right? The next one, notably, higher internalized, elevated behavioral problems are being reported by the parents. So again, you got to parse away the stuff that's distracting to you and go, so we're looking at behavioral problems. Okay, so we're looking at problems. They're internalized behavioral problems, and they're higher and they're elevated. How are higher and elevated different? They're not saying the same thing. Right? And then the last one is a little more subtle. Right? Culturally, heterosexuality is the predominant norm. In a lot of people, that sounds fine. It's a very short sentence, and it is a short sentence and not overly wordy, but it does indicate kind of this ideological redundancy, because by definition, a norm is predominant. Right? The only time that you need to modify the word norm is if you're talking about something that's not a pervasive norm, so some sort of subclinical norm, or a norm among some subsection of the larger culture. But all you have to say in that sentence is, culturally, heterosexuality is the norm, because norms are predominant by definition. They are normative. It is the average thing. Okay. Okay. Another thing to look out for is unit length, and talking here not about length of words. I like big words, use them all you want, but length of sentences, length of paragraphs, right? And not that you have to have just the right size, but you want a mix of short and long sentences, right? If you have really long sentence after really long sentence, it gets tiring to read, and it can be hard for readers to keep up, and they okay, well, where was I at? And they'll lose track of their train of thought. But then a bunch of short sentences over and over again feels choppy, and it screws up your smoothness of expression. So you want a mixture of short and long sentences. For a paragraph to be a paragraph, it has to have 3 sentences. You cannot have a 1-sentence paragraph, right? Because paragraphs should have one main idea. And if you can introduce and fully elaborate on a main idea with 1 sentence, then you're a heck of a writer. But don't do that in a research paper. Save that for your tweets or anything else where you need to write really, really briefly. But 3 sentences in a paragraph. But don't go over the edge either, and give me these, page and a half paragraphs. Rarely is a paragraph 1 page in length. If you have a paragraph that's a page or over a page, there's probably more than one main idea there, and you should probably look at how to split that paragraph up. Because when people are reading, oftentimes they read paragraph at a time. Okay, here's an idea in this paragraph, now here's this idea. How are they related? And if you're having them track for a whole page and a half to figure out one idea, they're going to lose track of some of those details. Okay. Moving from economy of expression now to precision and clarity. A couple things on that. One, word choice. Make sure you're using words that mean what you think they mean. Right? And usually, I see poor word choice, people using words incorrectly. They don't quite fit. Whenever students are trying to do the right thing, they're trying not to plagiarize, right? They've read something and they're trying to paraphrase it. They're citing it, but they don't want to have a bunch of quotes in the paper, because I won't let them have a bunch of quotes in the paper. They're trying to paraphrase, and when they paraphrase, they end up using just synonyms. And if you just substitute synonyms for words in a sentence, oftentimes the essential meaning is lost, because the synonym doesn't mean exactly the same thing. So here's an example of a sentence that was in one student's paper. As detailed as the diagnosis may appear, poor inter-rater reliability continues to be a problem. And that doesn't really make sense, because a diagnosis can't be detailed, right? A diagnosis is either the end result of some sort of decision process, or it's a category, right? And how can that be detailed, right? And what happened here, the original sentence was, as detailed as the diagnostic criteria may appear. And they were trying to paraphrase. So they paraphrased diagnostic criteria down to diagnosis. And it changed the meaning. Right? So you may have to avoid plagiarizing, and to maintain clarity, you may have to get a little wordy. So you have these competing factors of the APA style here. So you may have to say something like, as detailed as the rules for establishing a diagnosis may appear, right? Which rules for establishing diagnosis is wordier than diagnostic criteria, but at the same time you don't want to plagiarize, and you don't want to have quotes throughout your paper. So sometimes you end up getting a little wordy. But watch out for your word choice. Make sure if you don't use a word often, and you look up something in the dictionary or a thesaurus, have somebody else look it over too, and make sure that you're using it appropriately, and somebody that you trust that is very knowledgeable about words. Because if you misuse a word, I will find it. Colloquialism is another thing people I guess aren't made aware of in other classes outside of APA style. APA is really not big on using familiar language, colloquial expressions, kind of everyday talk, right? Which gets back to that professional tone. So, example of colloquialism would be participants were given diaries so they could jot down ideas. Jot down is a colloquialism, right? Usually we try to eliminate colloquialisms because it's not always precisely clear what those words mean. What does it mean to jot? So use more precise language. So participants were provided diaries so they could record, or so they could write, so they could use a more grown-up word. Usually is what it comes down to. Other colloquialisms I see a lot of people. A lot of people think. Just say many people. Don't say a lot. Things will end up. What does it mean that they will end up? Right? So things will resolve. Use more grown-up words and not these colloquialisms to use more professional language. And it's also more precise language because they have usually more clearly established and agreed upon meanings than colloquialisms do. The other thing you want to look out for, or another thing, is jargon, right? Overly technical language, which usually we do when we're trying overly hard to sound fancy or smart. And also, individuals who have done a lot of writing within military contexts get used to just kind of ingrained with military jargon and acronyms, and you assume that everybody knows what you're talking about, but they don't. And so you got to watch out for jargon from particular fields, not encroaching on your writing and making it indecipherable to others. So here's an example of a jargony sentence that can be said simpler. Inculcation of a regimented respiratory exercise is associated with decrements in physiological markers of neurotic phenomenon, which is a very fancy way of saying learning breathing techniques is associated with decreases in physical symptoms of anxiety. Right? So you're saying it professionally. You're not saying learn to breathe right and you won't get so scary. Right? So there's this balance between trying to sound too smarty-party, but then not being too familiar, too colloquial. In the middle is where you want to be. Okay? So clear, precise, professional, but not too smart, if that makes sense. Other things to look out for when trying to write precisely and clearly, your use of pronouns. Make sure there's a clear referent that the reader can easily determine who or what the pronoun refers to. And then make sure the pronoun is in agreement in terms of both number and gender with its referent. If you're using they as a pronoun, better refer to more than one person, not one person. Examples here, we have Jones et al. Indicated that blah blah blah. He also reported blah blah. Two things here. Jones et al. Isn't a person. Jones et al. Is Jones and the rest. So that's a plural. So Jones and the rest indicated that they also reported. Okay, so make sure the pronouns match in terms of number. And if it weren't et al., if it were just Jones 2005, and you had Jones et al. Indicated blah blah blah, he also reported, that might be fine, but you want to be sure that Jones is a man. And a lot of times it's kind of part of our sexist biased language. We try to use gender neutral he, which research has shown doesn't exist, and we assume everybody is a man, or that if we say he, people know, well, I don't necessarily mean a man, I just mean he, like the mailman. And no, he means male, man means male, and you got to figure out if Jones is a man or not. If you can't figure it out looking at the name or looking up on the web and finding their picture, figure out another way to write it and don't use a gendered pronoun. Okay. Another one here, Jones et al. 2005 did not agree with the contentions of Smith and Barnes 2006. They further said blah blah blah. Here it's not real clear because we have two plurals, right? Jones et al. Is plural, Smith and Barnes is plural. Does the they refer to Jones et al. Or to Smith and Barnes? I would assume it refers to Jones et al. Because Jones et al. were the subject of the preceding sentence. But that maybe not what you meant. It's a little ambiguous. So reword the sentence so that it's clear who you're referring to with your pronouns. Okay. In terms of comparisons in your writing, you'll frequently be comparing and contrasting groups of people, theories, research findings, lots of things. And such comparisons are most clearly communicated, most precisely communicated when you use proper parallel construction, right? And parallel construction is about having being grammatically parallel, where you have noun lined up with noun, verb with verb, phrase with phrase. When you have these two things, each thing is complete. So if there's a subject verb predicate be compared with something else, you should also have subject verb predicate. So I have an example here. The first thing is something that's wrong, and then two ways of fixing it. So females respond to danger and distress differently than males. And in this instance, it's not too confusing. Most people get, okay, I get it. Females respond differently than males. But that's not what the sentence says. It says females respond to danger and distress differently than males. It could mean that females respond to danger and distress differently than females respond to males, right? Because we have if we had parallel construction, everything that was in the first part, because it's A is more than B, so females respond to danger and distress differently than. So after the differently than, if we had full parallel construction, we would have all the same stuff on the back end with the thing it's being compared to. We don't. All we have is males. We don't have males responding to danger. So the second one is a fix. Females respond to danger and stress differently than, so differently than, and now I'm going to have the same stuff. Males respond to stress. And here I just paraphrase danger and stress with the word stress, but otherwise I've got the same stuff. I've got the subject, the verb, and then that prepositional predicate. And doing that can be a little wordy. So the other thing you can do is to move the two things being compared to the beginning of a sentence together. So we have this third line here, which is another correction. Females respond differently than males. So right after differently than, put males up, and then have some sort of prepositional phrase for both of them. So we didn't have females respond to danger and distress. We push that till after we've got females and males both together. Right? Females respond differently than males to danger and distress. Okay. So make sure what you're saying is clear, and parallel construction is one of those tricky things that, again, harder to see yourself than it is to see in somebody else's writing, so it helps to have somebody looking over your work. Okay. Another thing to pay attention to, probably but the last thing we'll talk about today, attribution of action. You want to be clear who or what is the actor in a sentence. And one issue that some students struggle with is the use of third person, and because in some classes you're told, oh, you can't use third person. APA style, you are permitted to use personal pronoun to describe what you, as the experimenter, did or will do, and most often this is in the method section. And that's because if instead you use the experimenters, the experimenters believe that. Usually in a paper, you're talking about lots of experimenters, lots of researchers. And so it's not clear if you're talking about you and your partners, or if you're talking about some other experimenters. So when you're talking about what you as a person or what you as a group did, you can use the I or the we. Again, typically it's more in the method, not so much talking about things like I think or I feel. However, you can certainly offer your opinions in the introduction, but typically when you do so, you don't have to say I when you do. So whenever, like in a discussion, when you say future studies should address yada yada, well, clearly that's your opinion. You don't have to say I feel that future studies should address yada yada, right? And you might also use tentative language to indicate the statement is your opinion. So if you kind of want to provide a segue into some research and say something like, women may be smarter than men. That's fine. That's clearly an opinion that's out there. It's not something you got from somebody else. So you just that people say, okay, that's something you were saying, and they will attribute that to you without you having to say, I think women may be smarter than men. Okay. So you can use a third person. So an example here. Better to say I recruited participants from yada yada than to say the experimenters recruited participants, because that's maybe misleading. Like, well, who were the experimenters? I thought you were the experimenter. But better than that is to say just participants were recruited from, because in this case it's usually clear if it's in your method section. We know you're the one doing it, and unless you've introduced some other experimenter somewhere along the line in the methods, it's pretty clear what you're talking about. Okay, so even though you can use the we or I, don't use the editorial we, and that's when you use we for people in general. Like, oh, we are this way, right? So you could read something like, we previously reported similar findings in a college-age sample, right? Which isn't that good of a sentence, by the way, now that I look at it. But you could say something about that, about what you previously found, if you're talking about you and your fellow researchers. But you don't write stuff like, we have an innate sense of right and wrong, because it's not precise. Because people are like, you're talking about me and you, Are you talking about all people? Are you talking about you and the author and his collaborators? So if you want to say something about people having an innate sense of right or wrong, just say that. People seem to have an innate sense of right and wrong. And you can't say people have an innate sense of right and wrong, because then you're stating a fact, unless, of course, you're going to cite something to back that fact up. And if it's not an established fact, then you've got to use that tentative language. People may have, yada yada, which we'll talk more about when we get to citing stuff. But don't use the editorial we, is the short of that. And then anthropomorphism, which is a new term for a lot of people, and this is simply attributing human characteristics or actions to animals or inanimate sources. And most often see it when talking about anthropomorphizing studies, but you might see it in other results too. The scales avoided bias by incorporating a large number of items. Well, how did the scales avoid bias? Were the scales really careful? The scales can't do anything. They're scales. So the constructors of the scales may have avoided a bias, or bias may be limited in use of the scales. Right? You can reword it that way, but you don't attribute these actions to things that aren't real. Another thing that pops up a lot is the study challenged the idea that blah blah. A study can't challenge things. It can't go out and play football, get you a glass of water. It's not a person. And I say that, but the typical exception to kind of this anthropomorphism rule is that results and findings can indicate or show. So have the scales thing there, but also the results of the study indicated. And even though that's still basically anthropomorphism, is kind of accepted in the field. Well, yeah, but it's okay to say that. So there are some exceptions here. But in general, watch out for that. And whenever you're talking about concluding something, always talk about the authors. The authors concluded, or the authors suggested. A study didn't suggest something. Okay. So attribute the action to the authors of a study, usually when talking about something that a study did. Okay. Summing up. This is a lot of stuff, but best to kind of be aware of the main ideas. Being concise, I think, is one of the key ideas here. We're often given limited space to convey our ideas, so be brief. Be precise. Say what you mean in such a way that it can be easily understood, and eliminate sources of misunderstandings. Okay. So say what you mean what you say, that kind of thing. And then professional flow, which is, for me, trying to communicate two ideas here. You want your writing to flow, to be smooth and readable, but then it's got to stay in kind of these nebulous boundaries of professionalism. Right? It's not the same as writing to your friends or writing a work of fiction. And as I said before, my recommendation to you is to focus more on the professional side for now and just kind of follow all the rules. And once you master those, then you can start making your writing more entertaining. But if you start with, I'm going to make it really flowery and poetic, you're going to really struggle with the other stuff. So start with make it boring first, and then you can dress it up with transitions and a phrase here and there, maybe. Okay. And the last thing, just kind of remind you that the style manual is a reference tool. It's not something that you should try to memorize all the rules. Get an idea of the rules so you know what to look out for as you're writing. Oh, yeah, I wonder, should I capitalize this or not? There's probably a rule about that. Oh, is it clear what I'm talking about here? Have those ideas in your head, but then pull the book out when you're writing, and then after you've written something, and look stuff up. Right? People that have been using the manuals for years and years, and nobody's used the manual for a long time because they keep changing them. But even people that get used to following these rules, still, I can't remember now. Would you use a colon here if you use it one space or two spaces? And you don't just go, well, it doesn't really matter. You look it up, because we all kind of agree to play by these same rules and have this standardized approach for communicating ideas, so that we can have more of a community of information, of science, and ideas can progress. So treat it as a reference tool, not as a textbook that you're going to read now and then maybe memorize, maybe forget, but not, and then sell it at the end of the semester. Hang on to it. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.